All right, here we go. Welcome, everybody. So I'm here, Chris Frederick from Political Perspective. We have Peyton Smith from over at Fourth Radical. And we are talking Kropotkin. So we are looking at the Conquest of Bread, and we're looking at chapters 1, 2, and 3 today. And I found it pretty interesting. So last week I read through those first 3 chapters, and then in the last couple of days I read through those chapters again because I just found I wanted to be, prepared to talk about it and stuff. And I found it just as interesting that second time going through. In fact, maybe more so because I knew where things were going, and I really liked some of these ideas. So the idea that struck me in chapter 1 was this idea of ownership and questioning who really has the right to say that they own something, and this idea that we really owe a lot of what we have as a society to the generations that came before us, whose literal physical labor and their sweat and blood went into creating this society. And so it stands to reason that the descendants of those people, as a community, as a society as a whole, not literally like by lineage, but as a group, we're descendants of those people before us, really should share in that hard work that was done for us. We all should be sharing in that. And I guess that's an idea that never really hit home for me before, because, I just sort of this capitalist thinking, which is, well, those are the people that own everything and they've managed to own everything. And this book really, I think in chapter 1, really one of the themes in chapter 1 is to get you to really question, well, who has the right to say that they own this thing? Just because you legally have collected it, does that mean that you really own something?
Yeah, I mean, the question of ownership is a really tricky one, and it's one which every country, every society, every culture has answered differently. And it's not one that we should just try to say, well, there's one way that ownership should or should not work. And we have to be open to that and admit that there, these ideas like property, these aren't just like eternal notions that are inbuilt and sort of ingrained into the human mind, right?
Right.
These are things which evolve and change over time. And Kropotkin makes a really good case for changing the way that we're thinking about property, thinking about social relations in our society and in our culture. Specifically, he uses a kind of scientific positivism, a kind of scientific argument for why this is the case. He's talking about, for instance, how we're able to remake our environment and able to produce more crops out of the same fields. He uses examples of artificial heat, and he says that, there's a quote which I found amusing, and he said, and we see a time coming when artificial light will also be used to stimulate vegetation. Of course, now we know that time did come to pass, that is something which did happen. And so, it is an instance where these technologies, as Kropotkin sees it, science and technology, can create a world in which we are capable of reimagining property relationships. Oftentimes, and I think that this idea is actually quite interesting because, a lot of people tend to think that science is deeply tied up with capitalism and that, these things are deeply tied up, but Kropotkin actually sees them as antagonistic, right? In some respects, at least. He seems to think that the scientific method or a scientific approach to biology or to society is one which is going to be counter to the capitalist mode of production and counter to capitalist thought. And I just think that that's kind of interesting. We'll have more to say about that as we move through it, but I just thought that was an interesting way that he kicks off the book, and he definitely follows through with that idea throughout not just the course of these first 3 chapters, but from what I've sort of skimmed through, it looks like he's basically following through this idea the rest of the book.
Yeah, I agree. I like that idea of science being a part of it, right? Where he gives examples from science and he talks about that moving forward, and that's good, right? You're not just ignoring this whole important factor of science, which seems to come up, I guess, in his other books as well, where he'll give examples from biology of and connect that to his writing. So that's pretty important that he can come in and tie in those ideas
Right.
from science and make sense of it.
Well, he more or less was a scientist for a long time. Like in the military, he would do scientific research. He would do geological studies as well for a very long time. And so science is something that for the entirety of his life, he deeply, deeply cared about. He kept up with the literature as long as he could. And, you go through the Conquest of Bread, there's many biological examples, some of which maybe we'll get to. But, for instance, he talked about like slave keeping ants and how it can be self-destructive. And, emulating their social model that they engage in. And actually, there's a lot of sort of parasitic animals out there which use that as a method to survive. But he seems to think that that's actually not a productive way in the long run to maintain a society. So it's actually quite interesting the way in which he's using biology or evolutionary arguments to do this. And this actually relates to an idea which we touched on last time around, which is that of social Darwinism, right? Because in many respects, he's responding to Herbert Spencer, who was a very, very famous philosopher and scientist at the time. His popularity deeply fell off towards the beginning of the 20th century, and actually, I should say, really the 19th century. Really, or actually, no, the 20th century for sure, but the 1900s really fell off quite sharply because of his sort of social Darwinism. But he was sort of a scientific positivist, following in kind of the work of Auguste Comte, and he, did a lot of scientific work. He was a kind of polymath in many respects, wildly famous, but he had a lot of works on social Darwinism, and Kropotkin read his works quite closely. He was sort of interpreting the work of Darwin and attempting to develop empirical or sort of scientific laws to explain societal action. And he would treat individuals as in competition with one another, and that the goal was sort of to compete with one another in order to, survive and have evolution, and that explains society moving forward. Kropotkin seems to be trying to reshift some of that stuff to say that actually what we should be trying to do is work together to try to compete with the environment. In other words, it's a question of, can we conquer nature in a certain respect, or can we use nature to then further our own development and further our own values and goals and the like. And that seems to be how he's really kicking off the book.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see where that kind of reasoning leads to what we have today, right? I found myself thinking about Amazon a number of times while I was reading this, where you have one individual, the capitalist, who sort of is reaping all the rewards, and you have all these workers working under that person who are not really achieving the share of the wage of the value that they're creating with their work, right? We know how poor the conditions are in a place like Amazon, and yet Jeff Bezos, just even in the last few months, I mean, his net value has absolutely skyrocketed, while the people who are traditionally working for Amazon they're definitely not seeing the realization of that value that they have put into the system. They're basically forking it over to the capitalist. And I think somewhere in here it was, it's like the serfs who were told, okay, you can work this land, but you're going to give a certain percentage of that money for every bushel of corn that you grow. You're going to hand a certain amount of this over to the person who is the quote unquote owner of the land, right? So you can kind of see the direction, what I would consider the bad direction that things have gone. So you can, I thought of that frequently while I was reading through this, those levels of inequality that you end up doing when everyone's competing and everyone's just trying to get the most that they can for themselves, rather than saying, hey, let's all just create value and we all can enjoy the value that we're creating.
Yeah, and there's actually, you mentioned the quote there. This quote I thought was really beautiful. He says here, quote, we cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasants to turn the clod of earth unless he surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop. We called those the barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced under the same name of free contract to accept feudal obligations. So he's making an interesting comparison here to capitalism and feudalism, arguing that in many respects, capitalist modes of production, capitalist sort of boss-worker relationships have a deep comparison, have a deep similarity with feudal relationships. And hold on, we criticized feudalism and said that didn't make any sense.
Right.
Why is this guy having to pay up his resources up to the feudal lord? Well, why does he have to pay his resources up to the capitalist? And then he goes on to point out how ultimately, he says, continuing on with the quote, just a few lines down, he says, for turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept it or die of hunger. So he doesn't ultimately have any real choice. We might say she as well today. And so, it is, I think, an interesting observation to make, comparing the capitalist mode to the feudal mode of production, saying that, well, look, at the end of the day, we don't really have a choice whether or not to work, we have to work for someone, and that is a problem, he seems to think.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if once it's put in that light, you start seeing that we really advanced all that much. You still have this sort of ruling class where they rule one way or another by being landowners under the old system, or here you just own the companies that are willing to employ you. So before you were told, yeah, you can make a living, so farm this land, but make sure I get my share. Is it really that much of a stretch to say, yeah, you can come work at my company, just to know that I'm going to be taking, 90% of the value that you create, I'm going to be taking that. So in some sense, you could almost say it's like an extreme version of that feudalism, where they're maybe even taking more of the value that you create than they used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how he traces this idea of science, right? He's saying that science is, the way forward, but then he traces that and argues how it's a system of pseudoscience, which is the thing which is propping up the current system, right? So he's explicitly arguing that this is a scientific approach to politics, right? So he says, quote, elaborated a whole system of pseudoscience to teach the contrary. Actually, let me just start up from the further up so you get the sort of full the full piece of it here. So the system under which we live checks in its turn the growth of the social sentiment. We all know without uprightness, without self-respect, without sympathy, without mutual aid, humankind must perish, as perish the few races of animals living by rapine or slave-keeping ants. But such ideas are not to the taste of the ruling class, and so they have elaborated a whole system of pseudoscience to teach the contrary. Fine sermons have been preached on the text that those who have should share with those who have not. But he who would carry out this principle would speedily be informed that these beautiful sentiments are all very well in poetry, but not in practice. To lie is to lie to lie is to degrade and besmirch besmirch oneself, we say, and yet all civilized life becomes one huge lie. So I think that this is really interesting how he's specifically talking about this system is being propped up with a kind of pseudoscience. And so as a result, we end up being forced to lie, forced to undermine ourselves, do the very thing which the sermons tell us that we shouldn't do in order to prop up the system, right? We have to end up besmirching ourselves. We have to end up lying and accustom ourselves to hypocrisy in order to maintain the system. And I think that that's like an interesting observation to make, linking in specifically morality with this kind of scientific approach.
Right, and I think we even sort of see that today when you bring up capitalism to people. I mean, they will defend it as if it is a religion. Like, they'll immediately come back as if it is a moral. As if it has to be protected because anything other than capitalism would be completely immoral, right? Like they've learned those same lessons and they've learned to defend it when someone questions it. That how could you even question this kind of a thing? So those sort of the lies that we're being told about the fact that this is what's serving us best, when it's clear who's actually being served by this whole system.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely like a deep sense which a lot of people will bring up, a kind of like, well, we have to defend the current system and we'll defend everything about it. Now, obviously, not everybody's like that, but there are people like that, right? And especially it's certainly in the interest of certain ruling class, certain ruling interest in society to have a society like that. And I think Kropotkin's absolutely right to point that out. And it's interesting, again, how he links that specifically with pseudoscience, saying that this is a sort of pseudoscience, that this isn't ultimately truth. So again, Kropotkin does seem to be engaged in the same project in many respects as Herbert Spencer, even though, again, Herbert Spencer, being a social Darwinist, not the kind of person who Kropotkin would have, been necessarily like buddies with, but he is engaged with a similar sort of process there, or a similar sort of project of trying to develop natural laws, or laws which we could find in nature or in science, which can explain human society and also try to give us a path forward for morality. Because he's saying that in the current system we have a pseudoscience, and that pseudoscience leads us to a kind of hypocrisy. So he's also arguing in some respects that this kind of pseudoscience, again, creates a world in which we constantly feel like we're hypocrites, where we constantly have to lie and undermine ourselves in order to keep up the current system. So he's making a deep connection between science and morality, which is an interesting thing to make. I think that like a lot of modern or contemporary philosophers would say that you can't really do something like that, but Kropotkin here clearly seems to think that he can.
Yeah, and that's definitely an interesting point. That, like I say, I think we can sort of see that even in practice now. One of the things that struck me too, there was a line in here I'll read in just a moment, but it kind of struck me the arbitrariness of the system, because, you know, a lot of times what we're led to believe is, well, the people that are the capitalists, the ones that are at the top that are getting all the benefit from the labor of the rest of us, they somehow deserve it. They somehow have earned it by being really, really smart or by working really, really hard. And here he points out the arbitrariness. And if the descendants of the very inventor who constructed the first machine for lace making a century ago were to present themselves today in a lace factory at Bile or Nottingham and claim their rights, they would be told, hands off, this machine is not yours, and they would be shot down if they attempted to take possession of it. So if you want to talk about, if you want to have that kind of a system, well, then it seems like one of the people who would have rights to that would be the person who invented it. But that's not even what we see. What we see is it's just the people who can buy it and who, you know, not necessarily that they invented it or they created it or made it a better system. They just had the capital to buy it and suck up these resources. And then the rest of us kind of have to go along and go, well, yeah, you're the capitalist, so I guess you get to reap all the rewards. And I thought that was an interesting point to make.
Yeah, he says, quote, right before the beginning of part 3 on chapter 1, he says, quote, more than that, every new invention is a synthesis, the resultant of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and of industry. I think that that's absolutely right. I think that's definitely right. Like all of our inventions are finally stacked on top of one another, even not just like mechanical inventions, but ideas, right? Like we take ideas, we bring them together, we merge them together. And all of our ideas are in some sense like collaborations. They're projects coming together. And so Kropotkin is, again, taking this idea, taking this approach of, again, trying to espouse a kind of scientific approach to explain how capitalist arrangements should work, to explain, or excuse not why capitalist arrangements do not work or are unnatural in his view. And I think that that's really right. And I, you know, it's actually not just the machinery again, it's also the abstract ideas which allow us to build the mechanisms in the first place. I think last time around I mentioned how, you know, like ideas like the number system, for example, are these abstract concepts, but help us develop machines, help us think about the world in certain ways, which allow us to approach even physical or material problems in unique and new and different ways. And so it really is a long project of lineage. And I think you're right to say that, I should say Kropotkin is right to say that there's reason to question that, reason to challenge that. Challenge the idea that just because you can buy something today means that, like, oh, suddenly you possess the rights to all of that going all the way back, that there is a kind of common ownership there. And I think that he's doing a really good job of building that intuition for us.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that completely. Another theme that I kind of noticed throughout the book that I found interesting was this idea that if you just look at what we're able to produce, we're generally able to produce enough to meet the needs of pretty much everybody, right? And this was back when sort of in the early days of machinery. Obviously, we've advanced quite a bit since this book was written, but it still seems reasonable to think that people just producing, like if that's what we focused on was producing the needs of people, we could produce a whole lot that could meet those needs, right? Rather than creating a bunch of resources, giving them all to a handful of people, and then you still have people that don't have enough. So you can even look back like early, you know, maybe middle of the last century, and you'll see those like videos where they look to the future and they talk about, well, 50 years from now, everyone's just going to work 2 or 3 days a week because we're going to have all these advancements that allow us to create what everybody needs to have. And yet we haven't seen that. What we've seen is there have been great advancements, but all that improved advancements, that improved efficiency and production just goes to Jeff Bezos, right? It goes all up to the top. He reaps that reward, and yet we're still working 40 hours or more a week, right? Rather than, yeah, probably we could all be working shorter days. Everyone could get jobs, and yet everyone would have food and clothing and a place to live and hopefully medical coverage and stuff like that.
Well, it's a little bit more than that. It turns out that, like, if I said, okay, well, I only want to work 3 days a week from now on, then, my boss will just kick me out and hire someone who's willing to work 5 days a week, or heck, maybe 4 days a week, right? Like, it's really difficult because you'll always find someone who'll say, well, look, I'll work a little bit more. And so then
Right.
it ends up being that we all need to work a lot more, even if, like, at the end of the day, all of us, like, if we all got together, we could all agree, yeah, actually, 4 days a week sounds kind of nice. 4 days a week sounds kind of nice. But you can't do that because capitalism forces us into these kind of very unequal, unfair arrangements, where we have to negotiate with someone who has way more leverage than us. So, you want to move into chapter two, or do you have anything else on chapter
I
one?
think that's good. Yeah, we can move on to two.
Yeah, so chapter two I thought was really, really interesting. I thought there was two main sort of themes that he was espousing throughout the course of chapter two. On one hand, he has this contrast between exponential and linear, sort of exponential growth and linear sort of development. And on the other hand, there's a contrast between relative and absolute gain. So I want to sort of explain what I mean by that. At the opening of chapter two, he begins by talking about Malthus. So if you don't know, Thomas Malthus, famous for his principles on population, I believe, what was that, 1798, if I'm not mistaken? Could be wrong on the date, but 1798, up there about. The famous book where or essay where he's talking about how, we're going to run out of space, basically, right? This is a very common idea, which a lot of people still espouse. And the idea, of course, being that population increases geometrically or exponentially, we might say. And so it's, it's a curve, if you don't remember sort of the terminology there. Whereas the sort of development of land, that's only linear. So yes, it seems right now we have enough resources for everybody, but eventually that exponential curve is going to go up and pass, and then we're going to, a bunch of people are going to die out. And ultimately, he used that as arguments against uniting the parliaments in the case of France. So France had commoners and aristocrats coming together in a single parliament. He said that that was a bad mistake. He approved of the English system, which separated the parliaments, and he wanted the aristocrats to have a veto power over the commoners for that reason. So he used these arguments to justify basically keeping the people down. So that was Thomas Malthus. And so he criticizes this view, Kropotkin criticizes this view by pointing out how the more people are crowded. Actually, I'll just read the quote here. He says at the end of paragraph 2 for chapter 2, he says, quote, the more thickly men are crowded onto the soil, today we might say women, the more rapid is the growth of their wealth creating power. So in other words, we're able to sort of remake the soil, remake the land. This links back into what we were discussing with chapter 1, where we see the coming of a day when artificial light will be used to stimulate plant growth, right? That we can use technology to advance the development of and the things which we can cultivate on the soil, right? So it's an interesting approach to criticizing Malthus in that way. I mean, it's, in some respects, it's become that, but then he employs it in, I think, a super clever way. Kropotkin just really blew me away with this particular comparison here. He talks about how a number of socialists seem to think that the number of capitalists would go down and down and down, while the number of workers would increase and increase and increase. And he says that that's absolutely wrong. And he actually is right to link this to Malthus specifically, right? So he goes in, I think this is maybe the fourth chapter. He says here, for alongside of rapid development of our wealth-producing powers, we have an overwhelming increase in the ranks of idlers and middle class and middlemen. Instead of capital gradually concentrating itself in a few hands so that it would only be necessary for the community to dispose of a few millionaires and enter upon its lawful heritage, instead enter into I just actually skipped a line, enter into its lawful heritage. Instead of this socialist forecast proving true, the exact reverse is coming to pass. The swarm of parasites is ever increasing. So this is really interesting here because he's linking specifically this idea of Malthusian linear versus exponential growth to the idea and analysis of socialists, right? So socialists did kind of fall into not necessarily Marx with his principle of infinite accumulation, but a number of sort of earlier socialists did kind of fall into this idea that because of the fact that there's a finite number of landlords who control all the land and population is going up and the number of product is going up, it's going to become over time easier and easier and easier to take down capitalism because there's only a few number of people who own all the stuff. And so eventually there's going to be way, way, way more people, and they're going to completely outnumber the landlords, and that's going to be it. It's X, it's done for. Whereas Kropotkin seems to be gesturing towards something which did bear out to be empirically true, I should say, which is that the rate of return on capital tends to be relatively consistent at about 20 years. So 20 years of rent is roughly equivalent to the value of the property. That's probably, I mean, probably reasons for that, maybe the length of a human life or the kind of length that people are willing to take long-term bets for or something like that, right? And so he's actually sort of gesturing towards this idea that actually, as the products of capital tend to increase, the number of landlords, the number of parasites tend to increase. And I think that that's an interesting comparison because he's basically saying, like, look, this revolution isn't going to be easy, right? Like, he's still wanting it, clearly, but he's saying that, look, this is not going to be as easy as some people made it out to be because it turns out the more you end up producing, the more population you end up having, the more parasites you also end up developing as well. So it's an interesting comparison there.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably get back to it in a little bit when he talks about how that revolution will come about. And but it's interesting to see him set the stage like that. And I found it interesting. I know I kind of paused the first time I read that because, as you know, when you start talking about mathematical models and statistical models, you know, he's making the claim that this is the type of growth that you see on this type of land, and so you have to be careful about extrapolating too far when you have a model. And that was where I kind of took pause and said, oh, that might, in the short term, that might be the case, but is it going to keep growing that way? You know, kind of like Moore's Law. People predicting Moore's Law is going to break down basically my whole life. Like, we're at the end of where Moore's Law is going to end, but it seems like this kind of held up where the land, because of different technologies that we've produced over the years, is able to produce more and more and more, right? With, you know, there for hundreds and hundreds of years, I guess probably longer than that, we've been breeding certain types of plants so that they can grow better. Now we can actually genetically modify things so that they can grow in areas where we couldn't grow and stuff. Mm-hmm. So we're still seeing that huge increase in the ability to grow food in areas where previously we couldn't, or on areas where we could grow food, we can now grow significantly more. And that, you know, in the past century, we've made huge gains in the ability to grow food. So that still has kind of held up about the fact that, yeah, we seem to be able to produce a whole lot for society. We could meet a whole lot more people's needs than we are under our current system. And I think that kind of relates to, there was a point I was looking at here. One of the themes I think came up. Oh, darn it. I just had it. Where was I looking? Where he talks about is sort of getting into the motivations of capitalism and who is actually served by those motivations. And he's got a couple of paragraphs here that kind of lay bare this idea that it's the capitalists who are being served. It's certainly not the people, right? When he talks about capitalists throwing away oysters because you wouldn't want it to become too common. You wouldn't want everyone to be able to partake in oysters, because then what would make certain people special? You've got looms and stuff not being used to produce clothes, and yet you still have people who don't have clothes, but it may not be profitable to sell those people clothes, so you don't produce that clothing. You don't, you don't dig the coal just because there's some people who are shivering cold. Those people can't pay a lot for coal. So it was interesting how he kind of then went into this idea of what are the actual motivations? Like is this capitalism really serving who we sometimes think it's serving?
Yeah, and that's a really good point to make. And I think it goes into the second theme that I was bringing up there, sort of relative versus absolute gains. I think this is maybe the sixth paragraph of chapter 2. He starts off, he says, "Nor is this all. The owners of capital constantly reduce their output by restraining production. We need not speak," and then this is what you were saying here, right. "We need not speak of the oysters thrown into the seas to prevent a dainty hitherto preserved for the rich from becoming a food of the people. And I think that this goes into this idea of relative versus absolute gains, right? Because they're willing to throw things away if relatively it means that they're better off, the
Right.
capitalist, he's saying. So I think that there's this may be a little bit fuzzy in his mind, but he seems to think that there's some kind of connection there between this exponential versus linear thing that we were discussing there with Malthus and this idea of relative versus absolute gains. I don't know that modern economists would see that link in quite the same way that he seems to see it, but he does seem to see that, or does seem to think that there's something deeply irrational about a system which does this, about a system which is preferencing relative wins, relative gains, as opposed to absolute wins or absolute gains. And so he says, for instance, that, quote, you were sort of mentioning there, he says, quote, a third or even often one half of their number are forbidden to work more than 3 days a week because soon the price of coal must be kept up, right? So clearly this is an instance where, if they work too much, if they ended up producing too much, then the price of coal goes back down, which of course that would be a disaster because then you're not making enough profit for the capitalist. And so we're not actually going to use the resources that we have available because we need to make sure that we can continue to support the people who he is describing as parasites, right? So there's an interesting connection to that, right? Because he's referring to them as parasites when the last time he mentioned them as parasites, he argues that the number of parasites are increasing because, again, he's sort of criticizing certain socialists who tend to think that the number of parasites would decrease relative to the population. He's saying that it's going to stay relatively consistent. And he's saying that essentially this problem is going to basically get worse and worse and worse as a result of the exponential increases of production. Like, we're going to keep throwing away more and more food
Right.
because we're producing more and more things. And he seems to see that he seems to think that this is just a general feature of capitalism. He seems to think that this is like a contradiction in capitalism or something of the sort. He says there at the end of that same paragraph I was mentioning there, he says, quote, in every civilized nation, there is a permanent population of about 2 million individuals who ask only for work, but to whom work is denied. So, this is still the case in our country today, where it's maybe not as bad as he's saying that there's a permanent population of 2 million individuals. I suppose that there's 2 million, but percentage-wise, it's less, right? But it is the case that there's always people out there who are looking for work, but they can't seem to find work, even work that they probably
Right.
could do. They're denied work because of various kinds of reasons. And he's saying, well, it doesn't make sense. If you have people who are willing to do work, who are willing to produce things, then why would you not allow them to work? Why would you not
Right.
allow why should a society just say that? Like, he would seem to say that that's just deeply irrational. That doesn't make sense. That's not a scientific way to organize society. If we're saying
Right.
that certain blocks of society can't even produce things when they're capable of producing things. If you can do something, then why are we saying we can't afford to do it? Like, what do you mean? That's sort of Kropotkin's, I think, general sense there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because I think depending on what type of leftist theory you subscribe to, it kind of makes sense. Over here on the left, we have people who need clothes, and over here on the right, we have people who want to work and earn things. So why don't we put those people to work making the clothes for these people, right? And if you had one type of government, you could have the government say, okay, you people now work making clothes, and we're going to make clothes till these people all have clothes. So, and if you had sort of an anarchy system, then, that would come about in a different way where those people would be able to meet the needs. In that light, I kind of see the capitalist as almost like well, I guess not like, but they are like a guard forbidding, nope, you people are not allowed to make clothes and help out these people over here who need clothes. I'm going to stand in the way because it doesn't fit my needs. It doesn't fit my capitalist needs for me to make large sums of money. And in that way, it just really puts a spotlight on this absolute greed that is actually hurting all the rest of us, right? The rest of us that are just trying to to have the basic needs that we have in our lives and meet those needs, and yet someone is actually safeguarding it so they can amass an
Mm.
amount of wealth that is unfathomable. I mean, I sit down and I literally can't wrap my brain around how much money Jeff Bezos has, and they're predicting it'll be 5 or 6 times that much, in his lifetime. So it's just that level of greed to me. There's no way to justify it, right?
Yeah, and he even goes on to say that it, in some respects, goes beyond just capitalism, and he links it specifically to the state. Kropotkin
Right.
being a bit more of an anarchist
Right.
here, and it seems to be somewhat of a criticism of imperialism. He goes on to say, "It is enough to cite the immense sums spent by Europe in armaments for the sole purpose of acquiring control of the markets." And so forcing her own goods on neighboring territories and making exploitation easier at home. The millions paid every year to officials of all sorts whose function is to maintain the rights of minorities, the right, that is, of a few rich men to manipulate the economic activities of the nation. So it's really interesting here. He's also linking in this sort of capitalist state system to the military and saying that the military is basically just here propping up capitalism or colonialism or imperialism in some way. And again, I think that this goes back to the sort of relative versus absolute criticism that he's making here. He's saying that, like, sure, relatively, you might be able to boost your standing a little bit here, but absolutely, I mean, you're just literally squandering money. You're wasting it. You're
Right.
wasting your resources when we could be providing for people. This is not scientific. This isn't a way that a species which is going to make it past all the hurdles of evolution is going to be able to do it. Like, this is a really big problem he's pointing out, and I think that I mean, at least to me, at least, this is persuasive.
Yeah, and especially since we can still see that in our modern society, where this absolutely insane amount of money gets spent on, specifically in the U.S., like the United States military. This amount, like how much resources are going to that could be meeting the needs of the people, and even our work, like you were kind of getting at, the work that our military does around the world is oftentimes linked back by people to capitalist endeavors, right? It's really about forming some type of money for someone who's already rich but wants a little bit more money. And so, a lot of resources are created, not given to people, and then they're destroyed in these military type actions of controlling other people around the world.
Yeah, and there's a few reasons why people might prefer relative to absolute gains. There's a lot of work in game theory, for instance, to try to figure out how we can create societies where people will prefer absolute gains. Some people seem to think that it's about asymmetries in information, right? So if you don't know the future intentions or future interest of another party, then you may tend to be more inclined to oppose giving them any kind of relative advantage over them even being willing to kick back yourself a little bit, possibly, if it means that you get to stay ahead quite a bit. And that's obviously a really big problem. I tend to think that it's related to a general concern of loss aversion, right? So most people tend to think, most research tends to show that people are more averse to losing things than they are to possibly gaining things. And I think that that leads to this discrepancy between relative versus absolute gains. And you can even look at it evolutionary. I mean, again, Kropotkin being very interested in sort of evolutionary arguments, perhaps this is something which he might if he were alive today, the kind of information which he would be interested in, for instance, that, perhaps in the past we lived so close to an instance of survival that a loss was perhaps so much worse than a possible gain. So, for instance, what am I talking about? Let's imagine, Chris, you win the lottery, you get a phone call, and you're told that you won $2 million. And then you get a call the next day saying, well, actually, it turned out that two tickets had been sold, and actually, you won $1 million. Now you're still happy, like you got $1 million, you got $1 million, like you're not,
Yeah.
it's not the worst. But compare that to your neighbor who initially got a call that said that they won $500,000, and then they got a call the next day and was told, actually, it turns out we thought that two tickets were sold, only one ticket was sold. Actually, you won $1 million. Well, let's imagine that you and your neighbor are perfectly identical. In both instances, you got $1 million and they got $1 million. But who's more happy? Your neighbor's going to be more happy
Right.
because they thought they got 500,000 and then they ended up getting $1 million. And so there is this discrepancy um, between how we feel about losing something and how we feel about gaining something, which does seem to be
Right.
engaging in a kind of relative comparison. And a lot of researchers tend to think that that is related to why a lot of people tend to prefer relative gains to absolute gains. So again, there's a lot of research to try to figure out how we can ameliorate these kinds of things with
Right.
institutional arrangements. But nonetheless, I think that it's interesting to point out how ahead of the time Kropotkin is in many respects by pointing out these very deep problems in human tendencies that really do trace into economics as it still goes on today, trying to research these problems.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. Where I think it's just part of human beings in general, where we have that kind of idea, that loss aversion, where depending on how the situation is set up, if even if your end result is the same, we interpret it differently depending on the steps that led up to that final result, about how good we feel about it and how bad. I sometimes wonder if it's also, in addition to that, a result of just sort of this like the culture of our country, specifically in the United States, this culture
Right.
of where we've almost fetishized greed. Right, we almost worship these
Yeah.
billionaires, and because you don't necessarily see that other places, but where this, like the mantra of the '80s, right? Gordon Gekko with "greed is good," that it's somehow, although it was, I think people largely misinterpret that movie when they watch it and don't see you're actually not supposed to agree with him. But he's kind of become the poster child for many people that think, yeah, greed is good. I'm gonna go make my peace. I'm gonna be better off than everyone else, and I can sort of look around and see how much better I'm doing, and then I can feel really good about myself. And I guess that's something that I sometimes see as maybe not the greatest part of our culture. If we could kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
move away from that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. There's also deep cultural elements as well, which exacerbate these kinds of things. And to point out the economic things, you're absolutely right, because then it ends up becoming a just so story where, yeah, I went out and pursued myself. I got rich, I got wealthy, but actually because of, the way capitalism works and the invisible hand and then blah, 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 actually I ended up helping everybody else. And it always just ends up meaning as long as I did everything legally or as long as I didn't get caught, anything that I could possibly do in the market means that I'm actually somehow, some way helping out lift everybody else up,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
it's a weird sort of just so story, and it strikes me as something that like you should just be inherently suspicious of. Look, it might
Right.
be true, right? Like I tend to not think that it's true, right? Like definitely not in all cases, right? Most research that I've seen seem to suggest that, but regardless, like it seems to be something that you should at least be inherently skeptical of because
Right.
it's definitely strikes me as a just so story. It definitely strikes me as a kind of a bedtime tale that you tell
Right.
yourself. And so it seems like something to me, at least, that you should have extra levels of scrutiny on compared to other ideas because it's a bit of a suspicious idea
Right.
at the very least.
And we need to, because it gets used against us as a weapon, right? This fantasy of the job creators. If we just keep making the rich even richer, they'll get around to creating some jobs for the rest of us,
For
right?
us, yeah.
We hear that all the time. Yeah.
Right. If we just give them more tax cuts, if we just send them more money, if we just stop asking for welfare, then, oh, well, that'll mean that they'll create more jobs for us and we'll all be better off. It
Right.
should strike you as suspicious. It should
Right.
strike you as suspicious.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else in chapter 2 you're looking at?
Um, let's see. Yeah, so there is some interesting parts where he's talking about how socialists go about to try to create the next world, try to create the world after the fact. And he specifically, I think this is actually linked to relative versus absolute gains. And he is, I think, again, he does seem to see a fuzzy connection between exponential and linear with the relative versus absolute thing again. Or well, let me just read this quote, and then I'll give the background here. So he's talking about how after the revolution may happen, or when we're trying to then establish the next society, he says, Socialist politicians, radicals, neglected geniuses of journalism, stump orators, both middle-class people and workmen will hurry to the town hall, to the government offices to take possession of the vacant seats. Some will decorate themselves with gold and silver lace to their heart's content, admire themselves in ministerial mirrors, and study to give orders with an air of importance appropriate to their new office. How could they impress their comrades of the new office or workshop without having a red sash or an embroidered cap and ministerial gestures? And I think, again, that this links to this idea of relative gains, that people are more interested in sort of getting, or at least some people might be more interested in getting a leg up over other people, that they want to be seen as more important, that they want to be seen as better. And Kropotkin seems to think that this is a really big problem. And I think that he's intentionally making a mirror here, making a bit of a connection there between these people who call themselves radicals but try to decorate themselves with an air of authority, and the criticisms that he made of capitalists, that they're more interested in relative over absolute gains. They're more interested in seeing to themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's a loose sort of comparison, but I think that it's there. I think that the same theme, the same idea is there. And he's essentially saying that, look, if these people end up being in power, then we're just going to end up recreating capitalism or recreating some other kind of system of exploitation. And that's why he says that these are the kinds of people, this is the kind of way, kind of approach that isn't ultimately going to work. And it goes to his general criticism of the state in general. Like, he's saying that this is part of the reason why state socialism may not work. This is what Kropotkin seems to think here, because you end up recreating the same kind of hierarchies that ended up creating capitalism in the first place. Because again, he seems to see it in human nature, that there's this kind of deep desire to, again, admire themselves in ministerial mirrors. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting criticism there.
Yeah, and if you're the point you're bringing up about relative gain makes sense, because if your ultimate goal is not necessarily to have a certain amount of money in a bank account, if your ultimate goal is to have power over other people, then that's really what you're more concerned about, is not the bottom line of your bank account, but how much more you have than others, how much power you can exert there, which seems to be kind of a thing that a lot of people fall into and then sometimes don't even recognize it. So that's one of the things that they've talked about, like in the United States, is that a lot of people who are rich and doing very well don't even recognize it. You go to somebody with $1 million home and they go, well, I'm not rich. That guy over there with a $2 million home, he's rich. Right? And then you ask that person, no, it's the guy over there with the $4 million home. He's the one who's rich. I'm just barely getting by. So people don't even recognize that when you look at the absolute numbers. But if you're looking at it with relatively and go, yeah, well, this is really about the power that I can exert, then it kind of shows that in many ways that's the ultimate goal, right? It's not necessarily to collect resources, but to have power over other people.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that in any capitalist society, more or less the median income is always going to be below the mean income, right? And, one of the things that's super interesting is that throughout history, most economists prior to the universal franchise tended to think that if you expanded the franchise universally, it was going to inevitably just soak the rich, basically, right? It was going to inevitably get rid of the rich. This is a kind of median voter theorem, right? Political science. That this idea that, well, if everybody had the right to vote and everybody was voting, then what that ultimately means is that you're going to, again, take away from the rich, because the average person, the average voter, the median voter, has less wealth than the average than sort of the average income. So they're just going to redistribute wealth downwards infinitely. And since that's just the stage of capitalism, and actually, most of the work of political economy in sort of the early part of the 20th century, even through the mid part of the 20th century, was trying to figure out, well, hold on, why the heck isn't this happening? Why the heck isn't this happening? And there's some really interesting research on that. We don't need to, sort of go down that rabbit hole here. But I think that you're absolutely right to make that criticism and to point that out there. I think that's definitely right, that there's this, deep concern here in capitalist systems that, again, the median person doesn't have as much as the average income. And so there's this constant sense of like comparing yourselves to the person who's just a little bit higher, a little bit better.
Right.
And that's definitely a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anything else maybe in chapter 2, or you want to move on
I
to chapter
think that
3?
pretty much sums up. I feel like he closes his chapters really well. Like his opening and closing paragraphs of these chapters are really good summaries of, like, they really kind of hammer home his point. So, like 2, he closes with the right to well-being. I mean, he really,
Which is the name of the chapter,
right,
basically, right?
right.
Yeah,
So,
actually, let's just read that. Let's just read the last paragraph of chapter 2. You want to read it,
yeah, sure.
or?
So the right to well-being means the possibility of living like human beings and of bringing up children to be members of a society better than ours, whilst the right to work only means the right to be always a wage slave, a drudge, ruled over and exploited by the middle class of the future. The right to well-being is the social revolution. The right to work means nothing but the treadmill of commercialism. It is high time for the worker to assert his right to the common inheritance and to enter into possession of it. And I don't know. I find his closing paragraphs are usually outstanding like that, where they
Right, and that leads right into entering into the common possession of it, chapter 3, which is entitled Anarchist Communism. So
right,
it's, he does a great job. And yeah, chapter 1 did basically the same thing as well. We don't need to go back to it, but it's, he does a really good job with that. He's clearly a fantastic writer. He's
right.
definitely a literary genius in many respects. He's quite good. Um, so was there anything specific that you were interested in this third chapter here?
There were a couple
Um,
smaller points. So, I kind of liked this when he talked about when labor, having recovered its place of honor in society, produces much more than is necessary to all. How can we doubt that this force will enlarge its sphere of action till it becomes the ruling principle of social life? And I thought that was a good way of summing it up. When labor has recovered its place of honor in society, which we even see somehow in our society today, there are certain jobs that are honest jobs, necessary jobs. They absolutely serve a purpose, and yet society tends to look down on some of those jobs, and you judge them, and you think, how could anyone do that? Even if it's not for you, it's one thing to say, well, I don't want to do this kind of job, but to actually kind of look at it in disgust and maybe judge people for that. So this idea that, when labor having recovered its place of honor in society, I think that's important. You go out, you work an honest day's work, you produce something for society, you contribute. That's an honorable position to be in. And if everyone's doing that, we should be able to create plenty for everyone to have their needs met.
Yeah, and one of the things that does really bother me in capitalism is the fact that, there isn't a meaningful distinction between social values and economic values.
Right.
In that, in our society, we value economic rewards. Like how much money are you making, or what's your job? And that's ultimately the concern. How much money someone makes at their job is, in some sense, a vector for their social status. Anyone's
Right.
social status is so deeply tied up with the amount of money they make, the kind of car they drive, et cetera, et cetera. And these sorts of comparisons that, there's a lot of jobs out there that are incredibly valuable that no doubt produce way more value for society than a hedge fund investor
Right.
or someone who's trading stocks on the market, like, creating way more value for society, but maybe only gets, 35, 40 something a year. And like, it's not bad pay always, right? But it's clearly not, $500,000 and it can sometimes be looked down on. It can
Right.
sometimes really be looked down on. Some of the, and I think that really got shown out during this pandemic, right, where we have these essential workers,
Right.
and it's like, well, people are like, well, we need to really care for our essential workers. Actually, Chris, one of the things that is kind of annoying outside of a mall, which is sort of near where I live, it's sort of just a few minutes away where I live. There's this mall, and there's this giant banister that they put up entitled, like, thank our essential workers or something like that. And then I came to find out that that same company, that same mall that basically like put up that banner, also like cut a bunch of workers and like
Right.
got rid of a bunch of people at the exact same time. So, we're out here praising essential workers, but economically we don't actually care about them, right?
Right.
So it's just kind of like exploitation there. But anyway, there is this sense in which in capitalism, we really value money, we value income. And I think that Kropotkin does see that as generally like a problem, that there's other
Yeah.
things which we should value. We should restore labor to its rightful place. And I think that that's like a really important part of overcoming any kind of capitalist system, of learning to value and treat people more equally and more fairly, independent of how much money or things like that, that's ultimately going to be a necessary stage to moving past capitalism. And that requires individual responsibility. That requires not looking at another person and thinking to yourself, not internalizing, I think, your own poverty, first of all, but also not looking at other people and thinking that, their cars, like it requires some kind of like personal checks on yourself. That's not always comfortable and not always easy. But
Right.
I think that he would suggest that these are kinds of things that are ultimately going to need to happen in order to sort of move past capitalism in any kind of substantial way. One thing which he did point out here, and I think that this goes back to the idea of all the inventions sort of being interconnected that we were talking about earlier. Um, he says at least on my book, it's the first page of chapter 3. He says, but nowadays in the present state of industry, when everything is interdependent, when each branch of production is knit up with the rest, the attempt to claim an individualist origin for the production of industry is absolutely untenable. And I think that this is really right, because now he's taking it at another angle. He's taking this same idea from another way. I was thinking when I was reading this, just how many different co-inventions needed to be developed in order for the Gutenberg press to like really take off. I mean, they
Hmm.
had various sorts of movable type in China hundreds of years earlier, and even in Japan as well. But it didn't really catch on in the same way. I mean, and also to be fair, their movable type wasn't as with Gutenberg, it was much more permanent. They used like metal type and it could last a lot longer. But in the case of Gutenberg, it was really set up in a right situation because various kinds of glue markets had been developing for other industry reasons regarding like painting. And there was also developments in like leather binding that had just occurred. And so there was a lot of independent developments, which made it so that when Gutenberg's press got developed, that it just exploded across the continent. That within 30 years, the number of books that were in circulation had like quadrupled, right? Like all of these developments, all of these inventions are intertwined with one another. In fact, you could have a fantastic, a brilliant invention, but then it turns out that people absolutely love it, could totally fill a market gap. But if there aren't other inventions that are set up in a social dynamic that are ready to, make it so that that invention can really take hold and really take root and be productive, then it's not ultimately going to work. And so he's pointing out here how even the success of individual productions, of individual products, ultimately depends on there already being a massive network to produce the thing, to create a need for the thing, and that these factors aren't totally clear. And I really thought that was just such an insightful point for Kropotkin to make.
Yeah, and to expand on that, I mean, even if today, say you come up with some invention today, and you want to expand your invention. I mean, what do you have to do? You have to go get the permission, basically, of some capitalist who deems your project worthwhile. He decides whether it's going to, or he or she will decide if it's going to make them enough money, and then they will give you the resources to produce your product. So it's really up to the decision of someone else. And to expand on what you were talking about earlier, I think you were making a really good point about basically that money is equal to ethics under this kind of system that we have, right? If it's related to economics in any way, people just generally tend to judge if that action was ethical by does it produce a profit, right? So like you mentioned hedge funds. Yeah, so a hedge fund buys a giant company and decides, well, the pieces of this company are more valuable than the whole. Let's chop it up. We'll sell off those individual pieces and we'll make a bunch of money for ourselves. In the meantime, thousands of jobs are lost. Thousands of families, are now financially in a dangerous situation. And yet we deem that kind of action to be ethical because it produces a profit for somebody somewhere, right? Some rich guy got even richer, and yet these families are out of work. And yet that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do in our society because we've decided that dollars equal ethics under certain conditions. Yeah.
Right. And also that like profit is the right like it could be the case that sure it might turn out more profit, but does that mean that it's like a better way to go? I mean, you've disconnected people who perhaps previously could work together more easily and collaborate more efficiently, and it's definitely very short-sighted. It's definitely a short-sighted approach to things. And I really do like appreciate just how far-sighted Kropotkin is in many
Hmm.
respects. I will say that that's one of the things that I'm really starting to appreciate about him as I read this book. I mean, again, the stuff we were talking about in chapter 2, how he seems to be anticipating many developments in economics which would occur in the 20th century. I mean, he's clearly a genius, as
Right.
I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, and another theme that I think I mentioned this last time when we talked, but one of the things that I noticed, like he talks about here, he mentions at St. Petersburg, if you are elaborating an invention, you go into a special laboratory where you're given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments, and then I won't read the whole paragraph, but basically you're given a place where you can go in and create. So he's acknowledging here that even though this individual is not necessarily making money, right? They're not trading their time for a certain amount of dollars. They are going in there, they are being creative, they are trying to bring something into the world, they are trying to create some invention which, theoretically would help all people if this thing was invented and created. And yet this person is doing it without any guarantee of getting a dollar back for this work that they're doing. And I think that under this capitalist system, it's easy to forget that people want to be creative. People want to do things. They want to create new things. They want to have hobbies where they can paint and they can do art and they can, do all sorts of stuff that, a lot of times we get in this thinking, well, no one's ever going to do anything unless you're paying them to do it. And yet all of us have things we do. You and I have these channels that we put a lot of time and effort into just because that's our creative outlet. That's what we are driven to do. And hopefully we are, improving people's lives by this work that we do. But we don't do it for a monetary gain. We're doing it because that's what we want to create. That's what we want to put out there, right? So it's good that he keeps bringing up this idea that if you give people time, right, so they're not working 60 hours a week or even 50 hours a week or whatever, you give them the time and the energy to do their own things, they will come up with things that benefit society.
Yeah, and one of his favorite examples, it's sort of right next to the specific example you were bringing up there, is the lifeboat. The lifeboat. Was it the British? I can't remember if it's the British lifeboats. But he specifically says here, in the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials for the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risking their lives in the raging waves, and they sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not know and what need to know. They are human beings and they need our aid. That is enough that establishes their right to the rescue. And I think that he's definitely right to point out how this leads to sort of communistic or socialist ethics, and that this idea is like deeply ingrained into us. I mean, again, he's referencing this idea of mutual aid again, that this is like very important for our own society, for developing our own resources, for developing our own, again, our society and culture. And I think that he's really right. I think that, that's actually one of his favorite examples, which is why I wanted to bring it up. The lifeboat
Yeah.
example. It's something that, from what I've seen about Kropotkin, he brings up in like basically all of his writings, that's one of his central and core themes that he keeps coming back to. And it shows him in his mind that this really shows how these ideas could really work out, that we need to model our
Right.
society on this particularly noble form of institution of arrangement. So
Right.
I
And
appreciate
what
that.
is it about the human brain where in an emergency type situation, people are ready to jump in and act and be
Mhm.
helpful and benefit to the aid of everyone and make sure that everyone is being saved. And yet when it comes to our everyday life, we don't necessarily follow that same instinct, right? That
Right. He mentions that actually. He mentions that. So maybe it's worth
did we
bringing up. Yeah, he
did he
mentions that. He says, suppose that one of our great cities, so egotistic in
Oh,
ordinary
right.
times, were visited tomorrow by some calamity, a siege, for instance. That same selfish city would decide that the first needs to satisfy were those of the children and the aged, without asking what services they had rendered or were likely to render society. It would first of all feed them. And so during a crisis, during a time of emergency, we actually come together. One of the things that actually I will admit does kind of annoy me about a lot of apocalypse movies is this idea that as soon as the apocalypse strikes, everyone's just going to be everyone for themselves and just I'm not going to care about anyone else, and we're not going to come together. And that may be true in certain sorts of apocalypse scenes.
Yeah.
Perhaps like a zombie apocalypse might be like that, right? But I imagine that most apocalypse scenes probably wouldn't turn out like that at all, that we actually would come together, right? That
Right.
we actually would come together and work together. Now, I understand like the literary reasons for that, like they're comparing it to like the state of nature and things like that. But like it does strike me as like, well, that's just like wrong. That's just like deeply wrong, right? Like we would come together if we were in a time of crisis. We see it all the time. We see it, anytime there's a major hurricane, like we hear all these stories about everybody working together, everybody
Yeah.
coming together to and in some respects, we see like the pinnacle of our virtue in these crises, which is, I think, surprising to a lot of people. But that's kind of just like how humans work.
Right. No, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, is there anything else that you were really interested in with this chapter? Because he's really just beginning to outline his anarchist
Right.
communistic views, and it's really going to be leading into the next chapter,
Right.
into chapter 4. So I mean, I don't know about you, Chris. I almost want to wait before touching into it too much, and then link it in more closely with our next section of reading. What do you think?
Yeah, that seems reasonable. We talked about a bunch of it already anyways, and then yeah, we can kind of talk about it as it leads into the next few chapters that we'll discuss. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, guys, thanks so much for coming in and tuning into this one. So next time around, Chris, what do you think? Do you want to go through chapters? Was it 4, 5, and 6, or do you
Yeah.
want to just go through? What do you think?
I think 4, 5, and 6 would be reasonable.
All right. So next time around, if you guys want to follow along, you can take a look at chapters 4, 5, and 6 in the Conquest of Bread. And yeah, thanks for joining.
All right,
See you on
thanks
the next
everybody.
one.
We'll see you later.